Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
And today, in our boasted modern civilization, we are facing just exactly the same problem, just exactly the same conflict between two schools of philosophy.
If you haven't noticed yet, Russia's invasion of Ukraine over 1 year ago has been a consistent motif throughout this season. The effects of the invasion have spiraled into a growing number of issues for multilateral organizations across the world to address. Perhaps the single greatest upheaval this invasion caused was in the security architecture of Europe. So, this week, we're bringing you a conversation with an expert at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCE, as it is known to help cut down on syllables, has 57 member states from North America, Europe, and Asia. It seeks consensus to drive politically binding solutions to a broad range of security issues, from outright war to environmental security to human security. And for an added wrinkle, Russia remains a member of the OSCE, sparking debate within and without the organization on including an aggressor and threat to Europe's security in an organization dedicated to upholding it. To discuss this wrinkle and help explain what the OSCE is and the value of issue-driven multilateral organizations, Allison Hart joined us on Diplomatic Immunity. She is the Senior Advisor and Chief of Staff to the OSCE Secretary General, Helga Maria Schmid. She took up this role in Vienna in February 2022. Prior to joining the OSCE, Allison served in a number of roles at NATO Headquarters in Brussels, including as Special Advisor to the Deputy Secretary General, Executive Officer of NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, and most recently as Head of the Human Security Unit. And as a special treat for our listeners, they'll get to hear a different voice on this side of the microphone, as ISD's very own Nathaniel Haft conducted the interview. Nate is currently a Dean and Virginia Rusk Fellow at ISD and is a career Foreign Service officer. He most recently served as a senior policy advisor on the U.S. delegation to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague. Nate's prior overseas assignments include covering rule of law and counter-narcotics issues in Pakistan, human rights in Albania, and consular affairs in Taiwan. In Washington, he served as a multilateral affairs officer in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs. As a note, although Nate is a career U.S. diplomat, any views expressed are strictly his own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. State Department or U.S. government. And in that vein, Allison's views are also her own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the OSCE or any member state. Let's listen to the conversation.
Greetings, my name is Nate Haft, and I am a Dean and Virginia Rusk Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. I'm also a Foreign Service Officer at the U.S. Department of State. Today, I'm very pleased to be speaking with Allison Hart, Senior Advisor and Chief of Staff to the Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Allison, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nate. I'm really glad to be here.
So this season on Diplomatic Immunity, we've been covering a variety of multilateral institutions. And over the past few years, I spent some time just down the road from you in The Hague at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And I know that each of these international institutions has its own unique character and function. So I'd like to start by asking for a broad overview of the OSCE as a whole, why this organization was founded, and how it operates today.
Well, thanks for that, Nate. The OSCE, as you mentioned, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, was born of the Cold War. It was actually born in the midst of the Cold War. In the early 1970s, as dynamics were beginning to shift a bit between East and West, some thought that there might be an opening to start some dialogue to begin thinking about how East and West could build confidence, start to build trust, find things that they might be able to come together around. And that's really where the OSCE began. It began as a series of conferences. The Helsinki Final Accords, which were signed in 1975 in August, were the product of these initial discussions. Through the Helsinki Final Act, the countries, 35 at the time, but again, Soviet Union, United States, much of Europe, came together around a certain set of principles on which they could agree. Sovereignty, inviolability of borders, peaceful settlement of disputes, some issues also around human rights and on economic and environmental cooperation. So that's where it started. It started as a dialogue, and not a dialogue among like-minded. I think that's really important, but a dialogue among those who really couldn't find a whole lot to agree on at the time. But this brought them together. At the time, they called this the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, so the CSCE. But as you know, we now start with an O, and that happened because as the Soviet Union, as the Cold War came to an end and the Soviet Union was disbanded, in 1990, the countries that had been part of this conference came together in Paris at a summit and looked at how they would manage change going forward and what this organization would become. They agreed on a lot of really ambitious ideas about how they could continue to work together in a comprehensive way, and I'll talk about our comprehensive approach in just a bit. But at that point, they also agreed to make this an organization, so to have a secretariat to support the participating states. They started a number of institutions that are now still part of our organization. Like the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights that's based in Warsaw, the Representative on Freedom of the Media that's based here in Vienna with our Secretariat, and then also the High Commissioner on National Minorities. We also at that time started our field operations. Originally, we were just in Southeast Europe, but helping to deal with some of the complicated issues that they were facing in the 90s. Now, where are we today? What does the OSCE do? Well, I mentioned a comprehensive approach. So the OSCE works on security, but our definition of security is perhaps broader than a lot of people might normally think. We look at this in three different dimensions. So the first is political military. That's more traditional. When you're thinking about small arms and light weapons or arms control, those sorts of things, anything that falls in the more traditional security realm, we consider in that first dimension. But there are two others. The second is environmental and economic. And here we're looking at the security impacts of climate change. We're looking at the impact of corruption on security. So we do a great deal of anti-corruption work. And there's a lot more work that goes on in that area. And the third dimension is the human dimension. This relates to human rights. It relates to the freedom of the press. There are whole lots of other elements to the human dimension, but when we talk about security, we're really looking at it comprehensively. The OSCE is made up today of 57 participating states. This spans from North America. So, of course, we've got the US and Canada. We've got all of Europe, including the microstates. We've got Ukraine and Russia and Central Asia, South Caucasus, all the way to Mongolia. So we've really got a broad participation. We have nearly a dozen partners for cooperation. So those are countries from the Mediterranean and also in Asia. As I mentioned, we have 3 institutions and we have 12 field missions today. So that, I hope, provides a good basis of what the OSCE is, why we were founded, and what we're doing on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's great, Allison. And very interesting to hear the political impetus behind the founding of what is now an organization, as you pointed out. And one of the interesting things, I think, about the OSCE is that it builds consensus to arrive at politically binding decisions, but not legally binding decisions. What is the difference between the two, and why does the OSCE focus on politically binding decisions over legally binding ones?
Thanks for the question, Nate. So politically binding decisions means that countries have come together and agreed on the issues that we're discussing, whatever those issues might be across the 3 dimensions of security. but they're not legally binding. The organization was not founded based on a treaty. The Helsinki Final Act was signed by leaders, but was never sent to parliaments for ratification. That was never the idea. And part of the reason we've done it that way is the OSCE has always been an experiment in the art of the possible. Where can we come together and agree on what we need to do going forward? Where can we find ways of cooperating, ways of building trust, ways of building confidence? So over the years, we've found that having these political commitments without a legal element to them has enabled a lot more dialogue, a lot more discussion, and frankly, more cooperation. Whereas if we were focused on making these things legally binding, I think we would get far more caught up in the details, and things would take much longer than they already do. So I think, again, political commitment for us is really useful because it allows us to engage and to make progress on some of these key issues for our participating states.
Thanks, Allison. That helps. And I want to also loop back to something you spoke about in your prior question regarding the geographical sort of spread of the member body of the OSCE, as well as the way that the organization views the issue of security in a few different lenses. This season on our podcast, we've explored the global institution of the UN, as well as regional organizations like the AU and OAS. And the OSCE is interesting as it's a multilateral organization that brings its member states together partially on a geographic basis, as you mentioned, across 3 continents, Europe, North America, and Central Asia, but mostly on the basis of an issue, which is that security issue defined in a few different ways. Could you talk a little bit about the benefits or drawbacks of a multilateral institution that is built around addressing an issue as opposed to being broadly mandated to handle every issue within a geographic region?
Sure. I think, part of what helps us in terms of having a focus on security, and as we already discussed, our definition of security is quite broad. Our approach to it is quite broad. But the benefit here is that of focus. We know what we're here for. We know what we're trying to do. We know why we're all coming together. And I think that helps us gain agreement. That helps us actually implement a lot of what we agree to do. So I think that focus is one area where this is really helpful. But the other piece I want to touch on here, and you mentioned this, and I talked about the breadth of our membership as well. We are a regional organization. We're the largest regional organization in the world that's focused on security. But it's such a broad region, and I think this really helps too when it comes to the work that we do. There's no other organization that brings together this particular constellation of states. And the benefits to that, I think, are really powerful. So we have states like the United States, like Germany, like France, who regularly work together on security and may have a great deal of experience on certain issues. We have others, whether they're in Southeast Europe, in the South Caucasus, in Central Asia, that would benefit from that experience, but wouldn't necessarily have the links or the ties that they would need to gather it from others who are perhaps more advanced on some of these things. So that's one advantage. But then also, I have to say, bringing all of these participating states together in one room, as we do on a weekly basis, even more often than that, but certainly weekly in our permanent council, allows us to hear a diversity of perspectives on the challenges that countries are facing. And this is really crucial because we know, of course, that a lot of the challenges that we face today are not limited by borders. Whether we're talking about climate that certainly doesn't respect any lines that we might draw on a map, or issues that affect us all, like terrorism and how to deal with that, corruption and how to deal with that, human trafficking, cybersecurity. These are important to all of us. But our experience of these challenges is very different. So bringing together 57 different countries to talk about these issues and to focus on how to deal with them is a real advantage. So I would say, from our perspective, focusing on an issue in this very broad regional context has been really productive.
That's really interesting to hear the framework of this organization being still somewhat regional, but a large region, while also at the same time focusing on an issue that is also has various aspects. I just compare it to my experience at the OPCW, which also focuses on a specific issue, chemical weapons, in the security field. But its membership body is global with 190 plus member states. So it's interesting to compare and contrast the different models and see what advantages the OSCE format brings. I'd like to now pivot maybe to a bit more current affairs topics related to the OSCE. And we've been talking a lot about security and OSCE's focus on it. I think when our listeners hear the words security in Europe today, most probably think immediately of Russia's war in Ukraine. What role has the OSCE played since the outbreak of the war in trying to mitigate or respond to that conflict?
Thanks, Nate. Of course, we recently marked 1 year since the 24th of February, 2022, when, we heard sirens in Kyiv, and we know that we had an office there at the time. It was under attack. I know that my boss was on the phone in the very early hours of the morning, talking to our people there and assessing what next to do. It's been a huge upheaval and a tremendous tragedy. In terms of the role of the OSCE, I actually, you asked me what we've done since the outbreak of the war, but I want to back up a little bit because the OSCE has been deeply engaged. Of course, Ukraine and Russia are both members of the organization. In 2014, when we saw what happened with Crimea and the illegal annexation there was also a great deal of unrest in other parts of Ukraine and concerns about what would happen there. And there was agreement to send in a special monitoring mission, and that was a task that the OSCE took on in 2014. It was our largest mission. It lasted until last year when it was forced to close because, of course, we do make all of our decisions on the basis of consensus, and we did not have consensus to continue that mission. But it played an extremely important role in monitoring the situation over those years, in helping to reduce tensions, in helping also to provide citizens with the everyday services that they needed, monitoring the contact line, helping with ensuring that people had water, that they could, that we would negotiate local ceasefires that would help in all of that. So we've been deeply engaged in this for a very long time. Early last year, in fact, just before the 24th of February, we were working very hard to advance political dialogue with the Russian Federation. We know that they were raising concerns about what they saw as happening in Ukraine. We, of course, were seeing things very differently, but countries had agreed, or almost all of the countries in the OSCE had agreed to put differences aside and come together in a renewed European security dialogue. This was a proposal from Poland, who was the chair of the OSCE in 2022. But of course, we've seen that the Russian Federation rejected that dialogue and chose force instead. Since then, there are a number of things that we've been doing within the OSCE. One, we remain a platform for dialogue. That dialogue is not necessarily very constructive on a weekly basis, but it's very important. So every week on Thursdays, all of the participating states come together in a room here in Vienna, and they discuss current issues. They discuss the war against Ukraine. That's the first item on the agenda on a weekly basis. And every week, the Russian Federation hears all the countries around the table calling out the absolute injustice of what's happening there. Every week, that's the conversation. Every week, yes, the Russian Federation may respond, but they're quite isolated in these discussions. So that's one piece. So that conversation is ongoing. When it comes to what the participating states are doing, there's an accountability mechanism, the Moscow mechanism, which is one of the tools within the OSCE that participating states can use. And through this, they can call for an investigation on violations of commitments, specifically on human rights. The Moscow mechanism was activated twice last year in this context, first in March and again in June, to investigate the violation of human rights that was going on as a result of this aggression against Ukraine. I mentioned the special monitoring mission that we had and that it's now closed. We also had another mission in Ukraine that had been there for nearly 30 years in various formats, providing support to civil society, to the government, and to the people of Ukraine. Both of those missions were closed because we didn't have consensus to continue them. However, participating states are absolutely committed to supporting Ukraine. And what we were able to do last year is launch a wholly donor-funded program, the support program for Ukraine. And that means that we're now back in the country. We're back with a team of nearly 60 people working on projects from everything from humanitarian demining to building cyber resilience, addressing gender-based violence, providing psychosocial support to those impacted by the war. We do a tremendous amount of work on combating trafficking in human beings. That's work that we do both in Ukraine and across the OSCE region. We're working on the environmental impacts of the war and so much more. So we continue to support Ukraine on a practical level, and we continue to provide a platform for dialogue to all the participating states.
I want to pull the thread just a little bit further on this topic of Russia and Ukraine. You mentioned that every week Russian Federation delegate in the meetings is hearing the outrage of participating states, and we saw it widely covered in media outlets, the OSCE's recent parliamentary meeting, particularly the coverage of the contentious nature between Russian delegates and other delegates. And you also mentioned the point, which I think is a very important one, that OSCE operates by consensus, because not all international organizations operate by consensus. The OPCW, for instance, where I was operated, it could operate through a consensus decision, but if there wasn't consensus, allowed for voting, similar to the UN. So there have been calls by some participating states in the OSCE, especially Ukraine, to eject Russia from the organization. What is the value in continuing to have a member state like Russia, which has been widely condemned for threatening the security of Europe and is able to block consensus? But what's the value of having them remain as part of the organization?
Thanks, Nate. It's a really important question, and it's one that we pay a lot of attention to. I'll start by just clarifying one point. You mentioned the Parliamentary Assembly meeting that took place in Vienna very recently. The Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, like other parliamentary assemblies for other international organizations, is an entirely autonomous institution. They have their own rules, their own procedures, their own decision-making bodies. So they operate differently than we do. But indeed, there was a great deal of questioning around the fact that there were Russian delegates in Vienna for that meeting, and there had not been Russian delegates at their last two meetings because they were held in other places where they were not given visas to participate. So that did bring a lot of attention to this issue. But in terms of the OSCE itself, we do not have a suspension mechanism. There is no mechanism for either suspending or fully ousting any of our participating states. Now, some have called that into question, and they've said, how is it that Russia can remain a member of this organization given that it's violating all of our founding principles? How can we stand for this, and what's the merit? And I certainly understand where those arguments are coming from, and I feel very deeply with those who say, "How can we stand for this? This is unjust." There's no question that what's happening is unjust in terms of the war against Ukraine. There's no question whatsoever. That said, the organization was not founded to bring together people who agree, or not people, but countries that agree on all issues. We came together so that we could find ways of coming to agreement, so that we could face each other, no matter how difficult the circumstances, and look for ways to reduce tensions and look for ways to eventually build trust. Now, clearly, right now, it's not the moment for talking about building trust with the Russian Federation. There is too much. The violations are too great. The tensions are too high. But that said, this platform is unique. And to say that we won't need it in the future is something that I don't think we're willing to do at this stage. So we don't have a mechanism for ousting. Russia is part of this organization, and we will continue coming together every week in the Permanent Council, and we will continue working on a full range of issues. And I just want to make one more point on this, because we do work on the basis of consensus, and that's important. But that does not mean that we have basically come to a standstill because no one can agree on anything. The OSCE continues every day to do tremendous work. We do this through our field missions. We do this here in the Secretariat. There's a great deal of work that's ongoing on the full range of issues. So yes, we're having deeply contentious discussions at the political level. But at the same time, there is still a great deal of good that's coming from this organization that's benefiting people on the ground every day.
Thanks, Allison. I'd like to conclude zooming out just a little bit and ask about OSCE's work with other multilateral institutions. So in a previous episode of our podcast covering the African Union, the U.S. ambassador to the African Union, Jessica Le Pen, talked about needing more of and, less or, when talking about which multilateral organization is best suited for which issue. What are some of the best practices or instances of success you have seen in bringing together different multilateral organizations and institutions to tackle common challenges?
Well, I have to say, I absolutely agree with Jessica about needing more and less or. Multilateral institutions each have their unique expertise, their experience. We all have our niches, or not just one or two, but probably many things that we're particularly well suited to do. And again, if we think about how complex the issues are that we're facing in any given area, whether it's climate, whether it's cyber, whether it's gender equality, pick your issue, it's always going to require more than one organization to deal with it properly, and to deal with it properly across all of the regions that are affected by it. So I do think more and is absolutely the right way to go. When it comes to the OSCE, we work so much with other international organizations. We work with the UN. Of course, we're a Chapter 8 organization under the UN. We do a tremendous amount of work with the UN. We work with the EU. We work with NATO. We work with the Council of Europe. So, and again, that's not duplicative. It's very complementary. All of the different areas. I'll offer a few examples. If we look, for example, at the EU facilitated dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina, obviously it's in the name, the EU facilitated dialogue. They're leading on the dialogue. The OSCE has a very important role to play in implementing what comes out of that. So we're on the ground in Kosovo working on implementation. And of course, that stems from UN Security Council Resolution 1244. NATO is also on the ground through KFOR, They play an important role. The UN is also on the ground. So we're all there, and ULEX. So we're all there. We're all together. We meet on a regular basis, and we all have our areas of expertise and our mandates. And that works extremely well. There's a reason that we're all there, and it's not because everybody just wants to be there. The reason is that each of us offers something unique and important. We see this not only in Kosovo, we see this across issues and across regions. If we look at issues, women, peace, and security is incredibly important. UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and I know we're about to mark International Women's Day next week. We all need to pull together to make this a reality. And here too, this is work that we do with UN Women. It's work we do with NATO. It's work we do with the EU and with others. There are more examples I can offer, but I don't want to go on and on about this, but I just want to say it's incredibly valuable to have multilateral organizations working together so that we can add the most value and for the best value at the same time, by not having each of us try to invent the wheel, but rather focusing on where we can add the most to any given problem.
I like, as you were speaking about each of the different multilateral organizations bringing their own strengths, I had the vision in my mind of sort of a jigsaw puzzle where each one was fitting together to complete that picture. And I really resonate with that. I also think it sounds like the more and slogan is catching on, and I'm glad you also resonated with that. Well, thank you, Allison. This has been really a fascinating conversation, and we really appreciate you walking us through the OSCE and its work. This has been very informative for us, and we thank you for your time today.
Thanks very much, Nate. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you again to Allison Hart for her candid insights and thoughtful responses. And thanks also to Nate Haft for joining us this week as a guest host. Stay tuned to Diplomatic Community as we shift focus on our 5th season from the multilateral organizations themselves to a deeper exploration of specific issues many of them face. Until we meet again. This episode was produced by Daniel Henderson. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website isd.georgetown.edu to learn more about our work.